Welcome to Vale Marks, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Today's video will take you on an emotional journey between a woman who lost everything and the dog who brought her back. This isn't just a story. It's a lesson in resilience, loyalty, and the quiet power of love. As Maya Angelou once said, "People will forget what you said, forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel." So let this story make you feel. Stay until the end to witness a breathtaking finale you won't forget. If you find meaning here, don't forget to comment, subscribe, and help Vale Marks reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world. The rain that night didn't just fall. It roared. It pounded against the metal roof of the small veterinary clinic as if trying to break its way in. Thunder cracked like the sky was coming apart at the seams, and wind howled through the narrow streets of the quiet mountain town, like a ghost looking for shelter. Inside the dimly lit clinic, Dr. Emily Hart sat alone, a mug of cold coffee in her hand, and fatigue heavy in her bones. It had been her third emergency case that day, and she was only just settling into the rhythm of small-town life. At 29, Emily had left behind a bustling animal hospital in the city to seek something slower, something quieter. The mountain air, the people who greeted each other by name, the space to breathe, it had seemed ideal. But as the wind screamed outside, she wondered if this small town knew how lonely it could be for someone who had given up everything familiar. She was about to switch off the lights when a strange sound cut through the storm. At first, she thought it was the wind again, until she heard it a second time, a low, broken whimper. Emily froze, her instincts taking over. She grabbed her raincoat and flashlight and pushed the door open, letting the storm slap her face with icy rain. The sound came again, clearer now. A weak cry, almost like a whisper. She followed it, her boots splashing through puddles around the side of the building where the dumpsters sat. That's when she saw him. A pitbull, curled into himself so tightly he looked like a discarded bundle of rags. His body was soaked, trembling violently, and barely moving. Blood mixed with mud on his fur. One of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle, and deep lacerations covered his torso as if he had been mauled or hit and dragged. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Hey there," she whispered, crouching down despite the rain. "It's okay. I got you." The dog's eyes flickered open at the sound of her voice, deep brown, wild with pain, but somehow calm. There was no growl, no attempt to flee, only surrender. Emily reached out slowly, speaking softly the whole time, and wrapped the shivering body in her arms. He was heavier than she expected, but she carried him like a child, soaking herself in the process. The clinic became a battlefield over the next 6 hours. The pit bull had lost a dangerous amount of blood. His wounds were infected, and internal bleeding was likely. Emily didn't have a full surgical team. She didn't have the latest equipment. But she had determination, skill, and a heart that refused to let him die alone. She cleaned each wound, her hands working with urgency but care. She whispered to him through every step, as if her voice could tether him to life. "Stay with me, big guy. You're not done yet." At one point during surgery, his heart nearly stopped. For a split second, she thought she'd lost him. But then, miraculously, he took a breath. Then another. And another. By dawn, her hands were numb, and the clinic smelled of antiseptic and metal. But the pit bull was alive. Barely, but alive. She made a bed for him in the back office, right next to her desk, wrapped him in warm towels, and sat beside him on the floor. She watched his chest rise and fall, slow and shallow. His fur was still damp, but the color was returning to his gums. A fragile peace settled in. She didn't know when she fell asleep, but she woke to a soft, raspy sound, like breath trying to form a word. Emily blinked awake and turned toward him. The pit bull was watching her. His gaze wasn't frantic or confused. It was deep, intense, almost human. Those eyes were filled with something that looked like understanding. Not the wild panic she usually saw in animals that had suffered, but something softer, a strange mix of exhaustion and trust. Tears prickled her eyes before she even realized they were coming. "You made it," she whispered. The dog blinked slowly, as if to say, "You did too." For a long moment they just looked at each other. Two beings who had no idea why the world could be so cruel, yet had found something in each other in the middle of a storm. She reached out, resting her fingers gently on his paw. "I guess that makes you my first friend here," she said quietly, trying to smile through her tears. "Buddy, that's what I'll call you. You're my buddy." It wasn't a grand name or dramatic, but it fit, because that's what he was, in the rawest, most genuine sense of the word. In a town where she felt invisible, where the silence sometimes echoed too loudly, Buddy had given her something real, a connection, a purpose. He didn't wag his tail, not yet. He couldn't move much, but his eyes never left hers. Emily didn't know what the future would hold for Buddy, if he would walk again, if his trauma would fade. But in that moment, she made a quiet promise. He would never be alone again. Neither of them would. And as the sun finally broke through the storm clouds outside, washing golden light across the room, it felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something neither of them had dared hope for. Recovery wasn't quick. It took weeks of sleepless nights, medication, and quiet patience. Buddy had been to the edge of life and crawled back inch by inch, guided only by the soft touch and steady voice of the woman who refused to give up on him. Emily kept him close during that time. She cleared a small space in her modest home for his bedding, carried him when he couldn't walk, and whispered gentle encouragement during physical therapy. At first, Buddy's legs trembled with each step, but he never growled, never snapped. Pain didn't make him mean. It only made him tired. But behind those tired eyes, Emily saw something stronger taking shape. Trust. Day by day, Buddy grew stronger. She began basic obedience training with him. Nothing complex, just the fundamentals. Sit, stay, come. He took to it quickly, watching her every move with a kind of devotion she hadn't seen in any animal before. She'd laugh sometimes, saying, "You're not just smart, you're a show-off." He would tilt his head like he understood the compliment. Still, not everyone shared her optimism. Pitbulls carried a reputation in the town, a mix of fear and misunderstanding. Some residents gave Emily side eyes when she walked Buddy down Main Street. Mothers pulled their children a little closer. One man even told her, "You're playing with fire, Doc." Those dogs snap. But Emily knew better. She watched Buddy every day, saw how gently he nudged her hand when she was upset, how he froze in place if a child ran by too quickly, staying perfectly still until the coast was clear. He never barked without reason, never lunged, never bit. He didn't just obey, he listened. One evening, a young girl named Lily wandered into the clinic crying, holding her kitten who had a broken paw. Her parents were still parking the car. Lily sat down on the waiting bench, tears rolling down her cheeks. Buddy walked up slowly and rested his chin on her knee. Lily froze, unsure. But then Buddy licked her hand, once, gently. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "Hi." Moments like that spoke louder than any defense Emily could ever make. Word began to spread. The dangerous pit bull wasn't so dangerous after all. Over time, Buddy became something of a fixture at the clinic. Emily began calling him her little assistant. He would sit quietly in the corner of the exam room, calmly watching as she treated dogs, cats, rabbits, sometimes even birds. Nervous animals seemed to relax when he was near. Maybe it was his quiet presence, or the way he never judged them for trembling. People noticed. "That dog's got soul," one elderly man said after watching Buddy soothe his anxious beagle during a vaccination. Emily smiled and replied, "He's got a lot more than that." Outside of work, Buddy became her shadow. He walked beside her on evening strolls, alert but relaxed, his head just brushing her thigh. When she stayed late doing paperwork, he'd curl up under her desk. On weekends, they hiked the trails outside town, where Buddy would dash ahead through the trees and always come racing back at the sound of her whistle. He made her laugh. He kept her warm. And though he never spoke a word, he reminded her every day that love didn't need to come in sentences. Sometimes it came in quiet companionship, in soft brown eyes and a wagging tail. Then, one morning, everything changed. Emily opened her inbox and found an email from a global animal rescue organization. She had applied almost a year ago, long before the stormy night she found Buddy. She never expected to hear back. But they wanted her. They were launching a new mission overseas to rescue and rehabilitate animals affected by natural disasters. The job came with better pay, travel opportunities, and a chance to help on a much bigger scale. It was, by every measure, the dream job she'd once hoped for. But it meant leaving Buddy. Not forever, she told herself, just for a while. The position was only a year-long assignment. Still, the idea of saying goodbye made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She called her old college friend, Marcus, who now ran a small boarding and training center just outside of town. He had met Buddy several times and adored him. "He'll be in the best hands," Marcus promised. The night before her flight, Emily packed the last of her bags and sat beside Buddy on the porch. The sky was clear, and stars shimmered in the crisp air. Buddy leaned against her, resting his heavy head on her lap. She stroked his ears slowly. "You know I'd take you if I could," she whispered. "But they've got rules. Quarantine, international laws, chaos. It wouldn't be fair to you." Buddy didn't move. He just listened. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small keychain, a tiny paw print charm. She clipped it onto his collar. "So you remember me, okay? Even if I'm far away." Buddy blinked slowly, nuzzling her hand with his nose. Then she leaned down and whispered into his ear, voice trembling slightly. "If you still remember me, if you still want to one day, come find me, Buddy. Just come find me." She didn't know if he understood. But as she walked away the next morning, watching him sit beside Marcus at the gates, she saw it again, that quiet patience in his eyes. Not panic, not confusion, just waiting. And somehow that made the goodbye just a little easier. The sun had barely risen over the dusty plains of northern Africa when the accident happened. Emily had been riding in the back of a rescue transport vehicle, returning from a field mission in a remote village where dozens of animals had been displaced by flooding. It was supposed to be a routine drive, 2 hours back to base, a warm shower, then paperwork. But halfway down the uneven dirt road, a motorbike veered into their lane. The driver swerved to avoid impact, and the truck rolled. She remembered the screech of metal, the world flipping upside down, the sound of her own scream drowned by crashing glass. Then, darkness. When Emily woke up days later in a hospital bed, everything felt distant, almost dreamlike. She couldn't feel her legs. At first she thought it was the medication, but when the doctors came in with their gentle voices and heavy expressions, reality hit harder than the crash itself. Her spinal cord was severely damaged. The words permanent paralysis echoed in her head like an unfamiliar language she didn't want to learn. In the weeks that followed, her world narrowed into a sterile room and a broken body. She stared at the ceiling for hours, refusing to speak. The doctors encouraged her to start physical therapy. She didn't answer. Volunteers brought in books, movies, even therapy dogs. She turned away from them all. When she was stable enough to fly, she was sent back home to the U.S., to a small apartment provided by the organization. It was wheelchair accessible, quiet and cold, in the way that unfamiliar places always are. Her career, once full of purpose and movement, now felt like a closed door. Gone were the days of kneeling beside frightened puppies, performing emergency surgeries, or comforting worried pet owners. Gone was the version of herself who ran on adrenaline and compassion. That Emily had been buried beneath metal and wreckage, and what remained was a shell. Friends called, emailed, knocked at her door. She ignored them all. Grief came in waves. It wasn't just the loss of her legs, it was the loss of who she was. Emily didn't recognize herself in the mirror. Her once bright eyes looked hollow. Her smile vanished. Sometimes she would sit by the window for hours, watching the street below, wondering if the world even noticed she was gone. Some nights, the silence pressed too heavily, and she would scream into her pillow just to hear a sound. Other nights, she cried quietly, letting the darkness wrap around her like a blanket. But every night, without fail, she dreamed of Buddy. She saw him as he used to be, strong and loyal, trotting beside her with that soft thump of paws on linoleum floors. She dreamed of the way he'd rest his head on her knee, of how his eyes held no judgment, only quiet knowing. In her dreams, he was always waiting, always looking toward her like he knew she was lost and was just waiting for her to call out. But in the waking hours, Emily told herself it was too late. She had given Buddy to Marcus, a trusted friend who would have taken good care of him. That had been over a year ago. Maybe Buddy had moved on, found a new family, a new purpose. Dogs forget. Life moves on. The rational part of her knew that. But the ache never left. One particularly gray morning, Emily sat staring at the only photograph she had left on her nightstand. It was a candid snapshot of her and Buddy, taken during a lazy afternoon at the clinic. He had one paw on her lap and his tongue halfway out in what looked like a lopsided grin. She looked so alive in that photo, sunlight on her cheek, laughter frozen mid-frame. Now she couldn't remember the last time she laughed. That day, something inside her cracked, not in the way that leads to more despair, but in the way a frozen lake starts to thaw beneath spring sun. A memory surfaced, her last words to Buddy before she left. "If you still remember me, come find me." It had been a silly thing to say, half joke, half wish. But in that moment, it became her only thread of hope. She pressed the photo against her chest and closed her eyes. Maybe she couldn't walk. Maybe she couldn't save animals the way she used to. But maybe, just maybe, there was still something, someone who hadn't forgotten her. And for the first time in months, she whispered a name out loud. Buddy. It came out small, fragile, but it filled the room like a prayer. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind that slipped by unnoticed. The sky outside Emily's apartment was a soft shade of gray, and the world beyond her window looked like it was holding its breath. Inside, the only sound was the slow hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of her wheelchair as she moved from one end of the living room to the other, mostly out of habit, not purpose. She was folding laundry, her hands working without thought, when she heard it. A knock. Not the loud, rushed kind that demanded attention. This one was soft, hesitant, like whoever stood on the other side wasn't sure they should be there. Emily paused, heart skipping once. She wheeled herself toward the door and opened it. Marcus stood there holding a leash. At the end of it was a dog, strong, poised, with a sleek brown coat and deep, intelligent eyes that stopped her heart cold. Buddy. For a moment, she couldn't move. The world spun silently. She blinked once, twice, trying to convince herself that her mind wasn't playing tricks. Buddy stared at her, unmoving. Then, in one smooth, almost surreal moment, he stepped forward. He climbed gently onto the small bench by the doorway, just high enough to reach her lap, and lowered his head onto her legs, right where her hands rested. Her breath caught. and then came the tears. They streamed down her cheeks before she could stop them. She bent forward, wrapped her arms around his thick neck, and sobbed into his fur. He didn't move, didn't lick her, didn't pull away. He simply leaned in, resting against her like a heartbeat she had been missing for years. "You came back," she whispered. "You really came back." Marcus stepped inside quietly, giving them space. He sat on the arm of the couch, smiling softly, emotion flickering in his eyes. "I wasn't sure how to tell you," he said. "I figured I'd just let him speak for himself." Emily looked up at him, wiping her eyes, her voice still shaking. How is this even possible?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You remember when I took Buddy in, right after you left? He stayed with me, but he never really settled. He wouldn't bond with the other dogs, didn't care much for anyone. Always stared out the fence like he was waiting for someone." Emily nodded slowly, her fingers stroking Buddy's ears. "Well," Marcus continued, "about a year ago, one of my friends from a service dog training center came by. He saw Buddy's calm temperament and thought maybe, just maybe, he could train as a support dog. It was a long shot, but Buddy took to it like he was born for it." "But," Emily hesitated, "why come back now?" Marcus smiled, then reached into his bag. He pulled out a folder and handed her a photo. It was a candid shot. Emily, in her old clinic, kneeling beside Buddy, both of them looking straight at the camera. She remembered that day. Someone had taken it without her knowing. She was laughing, Buddy's tongue lolling out. "That's the photo they used during the final stages of his training," Marcus said. "It's part of a process where the dogs choose their handlers through scent, image, or reaction. They lay out several photos, and Buddy, well, he walked straight past everyone else and sat in front of your picture." Emily's lips parted in disbelief. "He remembered?" "He didn't just remember," Marcus said gently. "He chose you. Again." She looked down at Buddy, who was now watching her quietly, his tail thumping once against the floor. "All this time," she whispered, voice thick, "I thought he forgot. That maybe I was just a chapter in his life." Marcus shook his head. "You weren't a chapter. You were the story." Silence fell between them, soft and full. Emily leaned back, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Her hands never left Buddy's fur. For the first time in what felt like years, the darkness that had wrapped itself around her chest began to loosen. The ache, the heaviness, the quiet despair, it didn't vanish, but it shifted. Because he was here. Because Buddy had found his way home. Later that evening, long after Marcus had left, Emily sat with Buddy curled beside her on the couch. She ran her hand along his collar, noticing the new ID tag. Beneath his name, it read, "Service Dog, trained to guide, love, and protect." Tears welled in her eyes again, not out of sorrow this time, but gratitude. She turned to him, her voice soft. "Do you know what you've done, boy? You brought me back to life." Buddy lifted his head, eyes meeting hers. And in that moment, she didn't need words. The look between them said everything. It wasn't fate or coincidence. It was something deeper, something rooted in love, loyalty, and the kind of bond that time could never erase. Emily had always believed in science, logic, and facts. But as she sat there in the quiet glow of her living room, a familiar warmth nestled beside her, she allowed herself to believe in something else. In miracles. Because sometimes they didn't arrive with lightning or fanfare. Sometimes they arrived on four legs, with steady eyes and a silent promise to never leave again. Emily had always believed in recovery as a linear process. You get hurt, you rest, you heal. But in the months following Buddy's return, she discovered it wasn't so simple. Not when the wound was beneath the surface, buried in quiet self-doubt and years of lost purpose. Her physical limitations were real, yes, But they were no longer the heaviest burden she carried. It was the belief that she had nothing left to offer, that her best days had passed her by. But now, with Buddy by her side again, something had shifted. The grief didn't disappear, but it finally had to share space, with hope. Each morning began with the sound of Buddy's nose nudging her elbow, his soft grumble coaxing her out of bed. He didn't bark or whine, just waited patiently, his eyes steady and knowing, as if to say, "You can do this. Let's go." Emily started small. At first, it was just transferring from bed to wheelchair on her own, then learning how to cook a simple breakfast without spilling eggs all over the stovetop. Buddy stood by for every moment, helping in ways no human could. He'd fetch her slippers, tug open the fridge with a strap tied to the handle, even press the automatic door button with his paw when she needed to get outside. But it was more than the practical things. It was the quiet companionship. The way he anchored her to the present whenever her mind wandered back to the accident. The way he climbed onto the couch and laid his head across her lap when he sensed the weight behind her silence. At night, when the shadows crept in and the dreams returned, the ones where she was trapped, broken, helpless, Buddy would be there. He'd paw at her gently, climb beside her in bed, and stay until her breathing evened out. Over time, the nightmares grew less frequent. The sleep came easier. One afternoon, while flipping through an old notebook, Emily stumbled across sketches she had made years ago, drawings of a mobile vet unit, a clinic built into a small home, warm and welcoming. It had been a dream she shelved long ago. But now, looking at Buddy curled at her feet, it didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. What if she could still help animals? Still be a vet? Not in the way she used to be, but in a new way. One that matched the life she had now. With help from friends and some quiet encouragement from Marcus, Emily set to work. She converted her sunroom into a cozy clinic space. It had room for a small exam table, shelves of supplies, and a waiting bench. Word spread quickly through town. At first, it was just a few old clients bringing in their cats or senior dogs. Then came the referrals. The people who said, "I heard you're open again, and that you've got a pretty amazing assistant." Buddy took his new role seriously. He sat by the front door, tail wagging gently with each new patient. Nervous animals seemed to relax in his presence. Children gravitated toward him instinctively, whispering their pets' names to him before talking to Emily. Even skeptical adults softened when they saw the way Buddy moved. Graceful, gentle, always alert, but never aggressive. He was more than a helper. He was the heart of the clinic. One afternoon, a woman brought in a beagle with anxiety issues. The dog shook uncontrollably in the corner, refusing to be examined. Buddy approached slowly, his head low, and sat just a few feet away. He didn't do anything, just waited. Minutes passed. Then, gradually, the beagle stopped trembling. It crept toward Buddy, nose twitching. Emily watched, tears welling, as her dog became the healer. Patients began calling it Buddy's clinic. No one seemed to mind that the vet used a wheelchair. No one questioned her ability. They saw the connection, the bond between woman and dog. And it spoke louder than any credentials ever could. Of course, not everyone was convinced at first. The pitbull stigma still lingered. There were wary glances and whispered comments. But slowly, as stories circulated about Buddy's gentle nature and heroic return, the town began to see him for who he truly was. He wasn't dangerous. He was devoted. He wasn't broken. He was brave. Local newspapers ran a piece on the clinic. The headline read, "Second Chances, the vet and the dog who saved each other." Photos showed Buddy lying beside the exam table, his eyes alert, ears perked, ready for whatever came next. Emily kept that article framed in the lobby. One evening, after closing up, Emily wheeled herself out to the porch, Buddy trailing behind. The sunset painted the sky in soft gold and orange, casting long shadows across the grass. She looked over at him, sitting tall, wind ruffling his ears. "You know," she said, her voice gentle, "people used to think I saved you that night behind the dumpster. But maybe you were sent to save me." Buddy tilted his head, then rested it against her knee. They sat in silence, wrapped in a peace neither of them had known for years. She didn't need the world to applaud her comeback. She didn't need to be the same person she was before. All she needed was this: a purpose, a partner, and the quiet reminder that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back. Especially when love comes back to find you. The night started like any other. Emily had fallen asleep early, the comforting weight of Buddy lying at the foot of her bed, his slow breathing a familiar rhythm in the quiet. Outside, the town had settled into its usual stillness, porch lights glowing softly, crickets humming in the distance, and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Inside, everything felt safe, peaceful. But sometime past midnight, that peace shattered. It began with a strange sound, muffled, distant, almost like the crackle of static. Buddy stirred first, his ears twitching, then came the smell. Faint at first, like burned toast, but it grew sharper, stronger, thicker. Buddy jumped off the bed, muscles tense. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he darted toward the hallway. Emily, still half asleep, shifted beneath the blankets. Then it hit her. The smoke. She woke choking, eyes stinging, lungs burning. Thick black smoke was pouring under her bedroom door. Panic surged through her, followed by something worse. Helplessness. Her wheelchair sat near the front of the room, too far to reach through the haze and rising heat. "Buddy!" she gasped, coughing hard. "Buddy, help!" She heard him bark once, then a metallic scraping noise, the sound of wheels on wood. Seconds later, her wheelchair bumped against the side of her bed, pushed by Buddy's strong paws. He barked again, urgent, and nudged her shoulder with his nose. Despite the thick smoke curling around her, she moved, one motion at a time. She slid into the chair, hands trembling, heart pounding so loud she couldn't hear anything else. Buddy ran to the door and stood there, looking back at her, waiting. She wheeled forward as fast as she could, sweat pouring down her face, coughing uncontrollably. The hallway was filled with smoke now, and the red glow of fire flickered through the front windows. The blaze had started in the house next door and spread through the old wooden walls like lightning. "The back door!" she rasped, barely able to speak. "Buddy! Back door!" He understood. He ran ahead, navigating through the growing flames and smoke, then waited by the rear entrance, pawing at the knob until she reached him. But when she tried to push the handle, it was too hot. The metal seared her palm and she recoiled with a cry. Buddy let out a sharp bark, then turned toward the nearby pantry cabinet. With surprising strength and precision, he jumped up and knocked a fire extinguisher off the wall, a leftover precaution Emily had installed months ago but never imagined she'd need. She grabbed it with her unburned hand, spraying the doorframe just enough to cool it, then rammed it open with her chair. Cool night air rushed in, but so did fear. Fire was creeping toward them fast. Buddy didn't wait. He ran ahead into the yard, turning back to make sure she followed, guiding her down the ramp they had built for the clinic patients. She didn't remember much after that, just the noise, the choking heat, the sirens in the distance, and Buddy's shadow always just ahead, always leading. Then, everything went dark. Emily awoke in a hospital room, white sheets tucked tightly around her, the rhythmic beeping of monitors nearby. She blinked against the brightness, mind cloudy and slow. A nurse appeared, smiling softly. "You're awake. You're safe." Emily tried to sit up, panic lurching through her. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Buddy? Where's Buddy?" The nurse's smile faltered for a second. "He's okay. He's resting. He took some smoke and has a few burns on his paws, but he made it. He never left your side until the firefighters carried you both out." Tears spilled from Emily's eyes. "Can I see him?" An hour later, Buddy was wheeled in on a padded gurney, a bandage on one paw, his fur singed in spots. But his eyes were the same. The moment he saw her, he whined softly and tried to sit up. Emily reached out, her arms open, and they embraced right there, her head pressed against his, both of them trembling. A nurse snapped a photo without saying a word, not wanting to interrupt the reunion. That photo would go on to touch millions, because by morning, the story had spread. Local news picked up the tale of the loyal service dog who rescued his owner from a house fire. But it didn't stop there. A few hours later, national outlets called. By evening, Emily and Buddy were on the evening news. The vet and her hero, a second miracle. Reporters came from out of town, cameras set up in front of the hospital. But Emily didn't care about the attention. She only cared that Buddy was alive. One reporter asked her what she remembered most. She didn't hesitate. "The way he looked back to make sure I was following. That's just who he is." Another reporter asked why she thought he had risked so much. Emily smiled through tears. "Because I saved him once, and now he's saved me twice." They called Buddy a hero, a symbol, a miracle in a service dog vest. But to Emily, he was just Buddy, her partner, her friend, the soul who never let her give up, even when the fire was closing in. After they were released from the hospital, the town held a welcome home ceremony. People lined the streets. Children held signs. One banner read, "Thank you, Buddy, our brave boy." As Emily and Buddy rolled into the sunlight together, side by side, there wasn't a dry eye in sight. An elderly woman whispered to her daughter, "I've never seen anything more beautiful." And maybe no one had. Because there, under the gentle light of morning, was a woman who had lost everything and found it again in the eyes of a dog who had once been broken, a dog who had once been saved, and who had come back, not just to return the favor, but to remind the world that real heroes don't always walk on two legs. Time moved forward, gently, as if finally learning to tread softly around Emily Hart. Months had passed since the fire. The clinic had been rebuilt with donations from the community and support from people around the country who had heard the story of the loyal dog who had saved his owner's life, not once, but twice. Emily and Buddy were no longer just names in a local newspaper. They had become a symbol of survival, of love, of the kind of bond that doesn't need words to be real. But Emily knew that stories like theirs couldn't be kept quiet forever. At first, it started with short essays, just scattered thoughts she jotted down late at night when she couldn't sleep. Little vignettes. The first time she saw Buddy's eyes open after surgery, the moment he placed his head in her lap again after years apart, the way he nudged her elbow every morning like clockwork. Writing became her second healing, a way to process everything, the pain, the fear, the gratitude. And with every memory she poured onto the page, she felt herself returning. Not to the exact person she once was, but to someone stronger, someone reshaped by love, grief, and the quiet determination of a dog who refused to let her fade away. She titled the manuscript, "The Vet Who Came Back." It wasn't just about going back to veterinary work. It was about something deeper, reclaiming her identity, her purpose, her voice. The title wasn't about her legs or even her clinic. It was about how she had found her way back to life, because one dog had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. When the book was published, it struck a chord far beyond what she expected. Readers wrote in from all over the country, veterans dealing with PTSD, parents of children with disabilities, people who had lost loved ones or parts of themselves and were trying to claw their way back to light. They didn't just see a story about a vet and her dog. They saw themselves in the struggle and the grace, in the quiet strength of Buddy's unwavering loyalty. The book made it onto bestseller lists. But more than sales, it sparked something larger: action. Emily worked with publishers and sponsors to launch a nationwide campaign using proceeds from the book to fund service dog training programs for people with disabilities. The goal was simple: to give others what Buddy had given her: freedom, comfort, and hope. Soon, Emily and Buddy were invited to speak at hospitals, schools, and rehabilitation centers. Buddy, now officially registered as a therapy dog, wore his vest with quiet pride. Everywhere they went, people reached out to touch him, to thank him, to tell him their own stories. And he listened, always calm, always present, just as he had done for Emily. One sunny afternoon, they visited a pediatric rehab center. The kids were all different, some in wheelchairs, some with braces on their legs, some learning how to speak again. Emily shared her story, not in a rehearsed, polished way, but gently, like she was telling a bedtime story to someone she loved. She talked about the fire, the hospital, the loneliness. She talked about how she had once thought her life was over, and how a dog changed that. At the end, a young boy, no older than 10, raised his hand. He sat in a bright red wheelchair, his arms resting nervously on the armrests. "Were you scared?" he asked, "when everything changed?" The room went quiet. Emily looked at him for a moment, her eyes soft. "Yes," she said. "I was scared every single day. I was scared of being alone, scared of not being enough, scared of not being able to do the things I used to do." The boy looked down, as if he understood more than someone his age should. "But," she continued, "what I learned is this. If you have one friend, just one, who refuses to give up on you, it can change everything. Even if that friend doesn't speak, even if he walks on 4 legs." She reached down and ruffled Buddy's ears. "Because when someone believes in you enough, you start to believe in yourself again. That's how you move forward. Even if it's slow, even if it's hard, you just keep going." There was a pause. Then the boy smiled. And in that moment, Emily knew why her story had never really belonged to her alone. It was a thread, woven into the lives of others, something bigger than one woman and her dog. That night, as they drove home, the radio played softly. Buddy sat in the back seat, head out the window, catching the breeze. Emily glanced at him through the rearview mirror and smiled. "Still showing me the way, huh, boy?" He turned toward her, ears perked, eyes gentle. They got home just before sunset. The light poured through the windows of their rebuilt clinic, casting golden rays on the walls where framed photos now hung, moments frozen in time. One photo showed Buddy standing proudly in his vest, a small girl hugging him tightly. Another showed Emily at her book signing, Buddy's head resting on the table beside the stack of books. But the largest frame held that first photo, the one taken before the world changed, before the accident, before the comeback, the one where she was laughing and Buddy was beside her, tongue lolling out, eyes full of life. She wheeled herself into the living room, Buddy padding along beside her. The air was warm, the world quiet. She looked down at him. "You ready for tomorrow, partner?" His tail thumped once on the floor. Tomorrow they'd visit a veterans hospital. The day after, a children's burn center. The week after that, they'd be in another state, speaking to new faces, planting new seeds of hope. And Emily? She wouldn't trade any of it. Not the pain, not the struggle, not even the fire. Because through it all, she had found herself again. And beside her, always, was the dog who had come back. Not just once, but every time she needed him most. If this story touched something deep in your heart, let it live on, through your comments, your shares, and by subscribing to Veilmarks. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they are reminders of what truly matters. Like the old saying goes, Sometimes the smallest step in the right direction ends up being the biggest step of your life. Emily took that step because Buddy believed in her. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there is waiting for you to believe in them. Let's build a community where hope lives and healing begins, one powerful story at a time. Thank you for watching. Subscribe now to Veil Marks and help us create more meaningful, soul-stirring videos that matter.